century. He was the first, he and Dickens in England were the first really hugely popular, financially successful novelists and artists on their own through the market. They sold books, they sold pictures, they sold essays. They were, and when Dickens came to America, I mean, he was, he had huge crowds. Even though the Americans didn't want to pay copyrights, they had, stolen copies of these things printed as the Americans didn't have trainers. Change that around the world. The big idea of Balzac was not just to write the novels and sell them, but to write explicitly, as Dickens did not, and the Italian Renaissance folks did not, say, artists are creators. We need to foster creativity because that transforms all of us in the whole world. And innovation is a major driver of how to think and act and do new things, so that's the core idea. And to do that, we almost need, and this was the more controversial part, we need to challenge the establishment. We should be more bohemian, breaking the normal rules of what he called the bourgeoisie. Today, people say the middle class, even within China. They don't use the Marxist labels anymore. Baudelaire, late 19th century poet, was the most important intellectual in Paris for a couple of decades. He was the model of many of the sort of the in journals. He was the politically like diversity today. Diversity today is very hot. It's very politically controversial. Trump, that all are fighting it. But you've got this conflict, and that was the same in France as well through the 19th century, basically. From the French Revolution, of course, through Napoleon, through the changes of government, this went back and forth. And where and how this would be implemented was very conflictual, and it still is there, even though it's not quite as conflictual. But in times of, I don't want to be economic reductionist, but we can say, and that was really not, okay, let's say from 1905 to 1914, France and Germany went through a huge increase in romantic revolutionary nationalism, which drove them into the First World War. Durkheim was the scientist. Durkheim was the most important, this is sort of the capstone of the 19th century. This happened not just with them, this happened across Europe and many other parts of the world. In Vienna, Einstein wrote about the theory of relativity. You think about relativity when you see these huge transformations going on around you, even penetrating parts of physics. Durkheim was one of the most important intellectuals from about 1890 to 1905. He was taken over by the Ministry of Education. He gave lectures to school teachers in the public schools. The lycées of France were tightly controlled by the Ministry of Education. And Durkheim said, do this, do this, do this. Teach secularism, fight the church, fight and so the Dreyfus affair was going on, and anti-Semitic policy within the military led to Dreyfus not being promoted as a general because he was Jewish. So that Dreyfusard discrimination led to this becoming more politicized, etc. So the next big one was the 1930s, when you had, again, the rise of Marxism in the West, including Greenwich Village, a little bit more. I mentioned the Robert and Helen Lynn Middletown, and then Middletown in Transition, which was a neo-Marxist inspired class business capitalism reinterpretation of what they wrote a decade or so earlier. Then we had more, if you will, more establishment style and until the late 60s. So the late 60s, 68, 69, 70. I showed you with the data we had on cities from the City Money book, how much that changed the policies of local governments. As we had this protest, activism, marches, demonstrations by municipal employees to unionize, anti-Vietnam protesters to stop the war, and then students who wanted more student power in the transformation, a more egalitarian direction, more participation. Okay, that then 20, 30 years later, as those people became elected officials like Biden, Hillary Clinton, you have this policy, serious Washington, and variations locally. So we have huge variations across neighborhoods, across cities, but these themes are still there in varied forms. Okay, they've been articulated in some of the most important actors. Let me add in the late 60s, was the planner, Jane Jacobs. She took these ideas from Balzac and from the others. She brought it in her, she wrote a bestseller book called Death and Life of Great American Cities. And she lived in Greenwich Village in Manhattan. And so she blew up Greenwich Village and said, you know, this is the future. Innovation is what we need. She then wrote in what sounded more like economics, but it was a popular economics. Related was Joseph Schumpeter at Harvard, who had been a top German who left with the Nazis. But his book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, basically said capitalism succeeds because it destroys the old continuous in a critical part of new ideas, and economic growth is the destruction of the old. So that linked back with Balzac and with the Bohemian ideas. And so these came together in the work of Richard Florida, Edward Glaser, who explicitly cite Jane Jacobs as a major source of their ideas. Okay, let's look at a couple of variations if they work okay. Were you able to get the so go ahead, Jake, with what you have.
Which video would you like me to show?
I think in the same order I had them listed there, but no, that's me. Did I send you that? Okay.
You did send me this.
No, I didn't mean to have me. I'm talking here. But get this. We want Florida.
Okay.
Now
Now
we
we Florida on the Colbert Report.
Yes, Colbert Report is great.
Gotcha. What number share this to the Zoom?
Okay, Colbert Report is last year, I believe. A year. This is very contemporary Florida.
Funny, did you turn it all the way up?
You can turn it way up,
Right.
wherever it goes. And you have it on max.
Joining me to
yes,
defend
down
this
here.
indefensible theory is the author of the study and professor of business and creativity at the University.
This video or the other video?
Mhm. What Colbert is saying, you've written some outrageous things. And here we go. That's what I heard. Or no, that's okay. So Colbert is saying he wrote some outrageous things. We're going to refute you, Florida. And he takes two of the most controversial points in Florida's key book, which is called The Rise of the Creative Class. I think it's 2002, 2003 was published.
Try changing the speaker output on the computer.
Exactly. Yep, okay, this is it.
Now, folks, to see if
That's an outrageous version of, a brief part of what he has to say. And we mentioned several other books on the reading list, which have been bestsellers. What else do we have on Florida?
I don't believe we have anything else. These are the big.
Okay, so that's all we got. Background, just one or 2 points. He grew up and his father was a manual worker in an eyeglass factory in Newark, New Jersey. He went to Rutgers University as a college student, and he worked with the two Feinsteins, husband and wife, who were neo-Marxists, and he was a pretty radical neo-Marxist with them. And for 10 years or so, he really was strongly egalitarian against the elite, etc. Then he discovered the importance of these bohemian kinds of patterns and did a paper with Gary Gates, who was openly gay activist and UCLA director of research on homosexuals. And it made the argument, which you just heard briefly stated. When we, everybody else read it, we were amazed, and how can this be true? That gays really cause what he's talking about. So I asked him if I could have a copy of the data. Ed Glazer, who I mentioned is the lead urban economist at Harvard, now he's a student from here, from Gary Becker, looked at some separate data, but I then published in a book which had sections from all three of us, Florida's main paper, along with some stuff from Glazer, but most of all the chapter, which basically showed that Florida was wrong. That the percentage of gays, which he had, I gave the data to I won't go into too many details of how we got to this. So basically, if you take percent gays and percent educated, and then look at the dependent variable, Florida data, Florida engaged data. The dependent variable is the growth in high-tech jobs, computers and things of that sort. Those are increased more, he showed, if you look at the simple correlation with more persons who are gay. Gay being defined in their study as men living together at the same address, which has obvious measurement error in it. But most of all, they also they included other variables and controls in some analyses, but they did not include education and gays together, which meant when we did that education suppresses the impact of gays. It's really the education, or what the economists would talk of as human capital, was more important than being gay. So then we go through in that chapter, which is in the Cities and Entertainment Machine, a little later on the reading list, and show how this is this fits. Ed Glazer did something similar, and look at the Wikipedia entry on Richard Florida, and you can see the citations to these debates. Okay, Florida then brought out another book with this whole section on this, where he discusses these findings from us. Says, oh yes, Clark shows this and that, but he really segues around, and his bottom line is what you can see now, many years later. So basically, he's not accepted the social science refutation of the most dramatic finding in the book. nevertheless, I'm not trying to say Florida is wrong. He's on the reading list. He's smart, he's creative, he has lots of interesting ideas, but he's very sloppy and not careful with the testing of many of the ideas. So I gave you one example. The other one, which that Colbert mentioned, is what we call the chicken and egg problem. Does income or education drive gays, or do the present drive gays to move to a neighborhood, or does the presence of gays drive the innovative jobs to rise? Both of those are opposite paths, A and B, and I put them briefly on the board. And I said Christina Sakamoto has did work on this for 10 years, did a PhD, and basically we find that both are significant and important paths. But I'll show you a little bit more on that later on, which is not to say they're equal or that they don't vary. The big point is that they vary by region and locality and context. So in the Midwest and smaller towns and much of the American South, gays do not come first. It is total jobs that come first. In Washington, Boston, the sort of Boss-Wash area, and the area from San Francisco to LA, especially those two cities, it's the opposite. So we find contextual variations that fit with voting and with voting behavior and with attitudes and surveys and other things, where these bohemian styles are more present on the two coasts, and they're much less present, as illustrated dramatically, as Anna told us last time, in the American South. Okay, that's the sort of historic background. When we get to then assessment, generalization, that the next piece of this kind of story is, does this work around the world? Is this just an American story, or is this a world story? I mean, if I'm started with the Italian Renaissance, Balzac, Dickens, these are all the West. How about Asia? A student of mine from Chicago, Wono Jang, Korean professor at University of Seoul, actively worked with the mayor of Seoul, who was then, and we worked with, there were five other Koreans we worked with, including him as the most connected to the mayor. And so another one was potentially the research director of the Ministry of Culture. And at the last minute, that didn't go through, but we had meetings with the Ministry of Culture. We had presentations with the cultural staff and so forth. With the mayor's conference was held. There were a couple of hundred people, and there were maybe 6 or 8 Korean top specialists on these issues of economic growth, cultural change, education, and Florida and I were both there. We had a dinner. Florida was there for about 2 or 3 days. We had a dinner with the mayor. We had sort of informal dinner type discussions, as well as consulting discussions, as well as a big conference where we had presentations by experts from Europe and from Korea. Florida at the end said basically, the Koreans just don't get it. This doesn't work. They're not being, that is, what did he mean they don't get it? When I asked, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm from Seoul.
Go ahead. Please speak up.
First of all, the LGBTQ community has not ever spoken about in general, but even like culturally or in like the policy setting, or especially the more formal we go, like as in like the government or again policy making, it's not something that's ever considered, or it's not really talked about as much in like higher education as well, like especially when you're considering like social capital moving into different parts of the city and like trying to lead up to communities, like that's not really addressed this day be like popularized, or like you'd never go on TV and say that on national TV in Asia. And also I think that idea, when I read Florida's reading, it seemed maybe it's just like my perspective, and I just got back to like modern gentrification and like how. So I just think that the way that American cities gentrify works at a very different pace than Asian cities, mostly because like of like the infrastructure in place can't really go in like these huge dense Asian cities. It's not really possible to find an area to like change that dramatically compared to like what some neighborhoods like in American cities experience. So it's just like these values and metrics that just can't really be applied to the East, whether it's the version of talking about gay community or the rate of gentrification and like the movements.
Okay, so I mean, that's a good beginning. And a good, I mean, that is what's also good about what you said is that you're bringing it right up to present. At the time, and the conference must have been, I won't look up the date. It's in this book. Basically, Florida said they don't get it. One more anecdote: when he was in Moscow 2 or 3 years ago, we don't have that that little video, but we were teasing him about the labels. Dan Silver and I had a cafe meeting with him. The cafe was in a building in Toronto where there was a long featured permanent exhibit of Jane Jacobs and many of the Bohemian related small new firms that had names like Grace Angel or Tourism in Toronto or other kinds of things. Florida said in Moscow, he'd been branded a neoliberal agent of homosexual gentrification. Okay. And so okay, so I'll just say labels at least have been thrown out and he can laugh and tease about them. But if we try to get to more serious, and I'm pointing to Wono Zhang as a PhD from Chicago, Christina Sakamoto, and third, another Korean student who did a PhD here, Seoko Kim. He now is a tenured senior faculty member at the top, one of the top 2 universities in social science in Seoul, Seoul National University. Okay, his PhD was the core of this book. That is when we were, and so the conference was before the anecdotes you're talking about. When I would sit around, that is, I stayed on for 2 weeks after Florida left, and I started having these conversations, which went on for, I think, 6, 7 years, which led to all those discussions led to the many different chapters in this book. The co-authors are primarily Asians, Japanese, especially Korean, so a couple of Chinese. The Bohemian label was a critical one. If you ask initially in China, in Japan, in Korea, do you have Bohemians and might they be related to any of this kind of thing? The answer is, what's a Bohemian? The concept is absent from Asian, these major Asian countries. Then I pressed a little more with the Koreans and said, do you have any examples of this? And they said, yes. There was a TV talk show host who came out as gay, and as soon as he did that, he was fired. He tried to get another job for about a year, and he committed suicide. And this was widely publicized in Korea as the anti-gay position of the great majority of Korean corporate individual citizens as well as corporations. This was before the mobilization of the beginnings of LGBTQ activism, and so now there have been protests in front of the Seoul City Hall. So that's a visible but countering them are the big churches and others who are protesting